So now we're going to move on to the first theory part of this DVD, where white doesn't fianchetto kingside. Now this theory part's going to concentrate on a setup where white plays e3, leaving the bishop on c1, and bishop d3 and f3. So this is a very typical idea. I think it's suggested in Richard Palace's very good book on how to play d4. So let's have a look at what black should do. Well, after e3, we should know by now from the introduction that white doesn't want to fianchetto his bishop, so we should fianchetto our bishop. So b6, important way to continue. Now white continues bishop to d3. He's got to get this bishop to a sensible square. Bishop to d3 looks very sensible. Now bishop to b7, continuing with our plan, and white plays f3. So this is kind of a critical position for this part of the DVD. Now I think for this real theory section, I think it's more important for you to know the ideas that black has than the actual moves you should be doing and what order you should be doing them in. So the ideas you've got here are playing this knight to h5 move, bishop to b4, and I'm going to give another idea in a minute, but let's have a look at them one by one. Now I'm going to recommend knight to h5 immediately here. Now bishop to b4 is also a good move, but I like this knight to h5 immediately because it causes white some problems from an early stage. We're threatening queen to h4 check. How does he deal with it? Well, there's only really one sensible way of dealing with this move. Knight to h3. Try to bring it back to f2. And here I'm going to suggest a hacking idea. A real good sort of full frontal attack here. Bishop to d6. Again, bishop to b4 is fine, but this bishop's very actively placed here, pointing towards the king. So what can white play here? Well, let's have a look. I had one game which continued queen c2 here. Now, if white castles, which looks a lot more logical, how do we continue here? Well, a sensible idea is just knight to c6. Now, this idea is aimed against white playing e4. White can't play e4 now because we take on d4. Let's say white plays knight to b5, attacking our bishop on d6. Well, the plan is now just to drop it back to e7. And we want to go a6, next move, attack white's knight, and then bishop to d6 again. If white plays a move like d5, we can go knight to e5. Well, we just looked at bishop to d6. A more solid idea is bishop to b4. Now, this is probably the way you should play in general, because I think the bishop's well placed on b4, because it pins this knight down to c3, and maybe this knight on c3 is better than the bishop. So let's have a look at a couple of lines. Let's say that white castle is very logical. Black now should castle. And if white plays something like queen c2, I'd recommend c5 here. And I'm not going to go any further than this, but I'm just going to point out some plans that black has here. Well, one plan is d6 and knight to d7, a typical idea. Another idea is queen to h4. Another idea is this typical rook lift, rook to f6, rook to g6. So this is a pretty unbalanced position with chances of both sides. So quite an interesting way to continue. So bishop b4. Okay, this is a very sensible way to continue. So this is with this early knight to h5 move. If you're not too keen on this knight to h5 move, which I can understand a lot of players won't be, they maybe want to keep the position more solid. They want to just try to play the longer game, not go for the immediate attack. I'm going to suggest another setup against this, which I checked on ChessBase, and it's not played a lot, but I actually think it's quite a promising setup. The Dutch expert Robert Bellin has chosen this setup from black's point of view, and it's well worth remembering. I'd only recommend this when white plays f3. Now, I've said in the past, bishop b4 is a very good square for the bishop. This is true, and you can continue like this. I mean, one of the good things about this setup is black's got so many different ways to play, and I don't know if one's better than the other, but a solid way to play here is g6. Now, this is a very interesting idea, and I quite like this idea. I think I'll give this a go in my next game. Now, what is black planning here? Well, black's planning to go bishop to g7, obviously, and then continue with d6 and e5. Now, a good point about having a pawn on g6 is it over-defends black's pawn on f5. So when we play e5, we don't have to worry so much about bishop takes f5. It's defended by the g6 pawn. Now let's have a look at how this game that Belin played continued. Well, his opponent continued knight e2, which I'm sure most of your opponents will continue. Bishop to g7. A very logical way to continue from black. White now castled. Black now castled. And black is now ready to play d6 and e5. I like black's setup. It's very flexible and it's a bit like a Leningrad, but we have our bishop on b7. So I think it's an improved version of the Leningrad Dutch from a black perspective. Now the only move in general that black has to be worried about in these positions is e4. And this is exactly what white played here. If white doesn't go e4, we're going d6 and e5. So white played e4. So how should we counter this? Well, Belin played very well. He captured on e4. White recaptured back with his pawn, keeping a strong centre. And now the move we have to be scared about here is pawn to e5. We don't want to allow white to play pawn to e5 because we're going to come horribly passive here if white ever gets this advance in. So we've got to stop this move e5. So the only way we can stop this is by going e5 ourselves, which is a very nice move. Another good factor about this move is that we're keeping the light squared bishop on d3, white's light squared bishop, a very passive piece. We're not letting it back into the game. So now if white captures this pawn on e5, we would just continue knight to g4. And we're going to win the pawn back on e5 with a very promising position. So I wouldn't recommend white plays this. In the game, white's played bishop to g5, and now black just captured on d4, and after knight takes d4, black played the solid queen to e8, getting out of the pin with mutual chances. Let's just sum up this position. White's got quite a bad pawn structure on e4 and c4. Black's got to really take control of this e5 square. But maybe white's got a bit more space here, so that's why I'm saying it's roughly equal. So let's sum up this opening anyway, and the theory section if white plays e3, bishop to d3 and f3. I've given you a number of ways that you can play against this. I think if you really want to go for a win, you want to go for a hack, you should either play knight to h5 early, and then bishop to d6 or bishop to b4. But if you want to play a solid system, which I think is a very promising system, and possibly the best system, I'd recommend you play g6 and bishop to g7, with the idea of continuing pawn to d6 and pawn to e5. So a number of ways you can play against this. I think black should be quite comfortable in all of these systems. Pick what you want, whatever suits your style really. Okay, we'll move on to the next theory section. This is where white doesn't play f3, but knight to f3. Not a worrying variation, but a variation we have to look at.